Hello and welcome. I'm so glad you're here tonight. My name is Narrator's Name, and I'll be accompanying you on this journey through tonight's story. It's called A Lingering Silence, and I hope you'll find it both compelling and calming as we gently make our way through its twists and turns. If you're listening right now, I'd love to know where you're joining from tonight. Perhaps you're curled up in bed, or maybe you're on a quiet sofa, wrapped in a soft blanket, ready to unwind. Wherever you are, take a moment to settle in, let your body relax, and prepare for the soothing rhythm of storytelling to guide you toward rest. Let's begin. It was one of those mornings where everything felt just slightly off kilter, even though it took me a while to realize why. The sun was already casting a soft, golden light across the windowsill, warming the edge of the duvet where I'd kicked it halfway off in my sleep. The sound of birds chirping had been steady in the background, faint but cheerful, cutting through the stillness of the house. And yet, there was something that didn't sit quite right. A lingering tension I hadn't quite named yet. I'd woken up alone, which wasn't unusual. My wife, Lauren, often woke up early, far earlier than I did most days. She liked to make tea, take long walks, or sit by the window with a book before the busyness of the day caught hold of her. But today felt different. Her absence didn't carry the usual warmth of her quiet independence. It felt hollow instead, like the space she left behind was larger than it should have been. I checked my phone, seeing that it was already mid-morning. Usually by now she would have sent me a simple text, a little hello or good morning to let me know what she was up to. But today, my screen was blank, save for the sprawl of notifications that didn't matter much to me. Emails I'd skim later, a few meaningless app updates. Trying not to overthink it, I sent her a message. Good morning. You're up and out early today. What are you up to? A straightforward question. Nothing that demanded much, just a nudge to hear her voice through a screen. I stared at her name at the top of the chat for a moment before placing my phone back on the nightstand. It hummed faintly beneath my gaze, looking small and unhelpful as it lay there. I started to go about my day, the usual morning things, stretching lazily, pulling on sweatpants, letting the chill of the hardwood floor surprise me as I fetched coffee from the kitchen. The steam rose steadily from my mug, curling into the quiet stillness of the room. I could hear the distant hum of traffic outside the walls of the house, cars making their way to wherever they needed to be. None of it seemed quite real, though. My thoughts kept circling around Lauren instead, wondering whether she was sipping on her tea somewhere peaceful or walking down one of her favorite trails through the woods. I glanced at my phone again. Still nothing. The small vibrations of unease I'd felt earlier were growing now, their rhythm pulsing faintly in my chest. It was unlike her, this silence. Lauren was quiet, yes, but she wasn't absent. She was almost unfailing in her responsiveness. The type of person who would glance at her phone several times an hour in case someone needed her. At noon, I sent her another message. You're being unusually quiet today. Everything okay? The few words felt heavier than they should have, their weight lingering even after I tapped send. My fingers hovered above the screen, but she didn't reply this time either. Not even the small, comforting ellipses that meant she was typing back. The hours stretched long after that, not all at once, but slowly pulling apart into fragments that tugged at my patience. I tried distracting myself, moving around the house in sluggish circles, as though tidying up or organizing papers might help pass the time. I'd flick the radio on every now and then, letting soft music flood the room, but it didn't seem to stick. The empty space where her response should have been was louder than anything I could play. By mid-afternoon, my unease had bloomed fully into anxiousness. Not hardened panic, not yet, but an uneasy, restless worry. I caught myself pacing the living room, walking back and forth across our thick woven rug. The fabric crunched faintly beneath my steps, its texture soft but rough around the edges. I stood near the window for a while, staring outside, the world moving around me with indifferent precision. I made coffee again, though I didn't finish it. Its warmth felt unearned against my unsettled mind, as though the steady comfort of caffeine was mocking me. Eventually, I sent another message, now shorter, sharper in tone. "Lauren, are you there?" The words left me quickly, impulsively, though I couldn't quite name the emotion they carried with them. Frustration? Fear? Could it be anger already? I set the phone down on the counter and tried not to linger near it. Tried not to reach for it every few minutes, knowing I'd find exactly what was already there. Emptiness. The air in the house had turned heavier now, as though the silence itself had grown into an entity, a presence I couldn't shake off no matter where I wandered. It was unusual for her to leave me waiting all day like this. From the moment we'd met, Lauren had been the steady, grounding force in my life, the person who would never let me spiral too far into doubt or fear. Her answers were always ready and reassuring, even when I didn't know I needed them. That she might simply forget to reply, that she might set aside her care, that just didn't fit. Over the next hour, the tension within me climbed. I tried calling her once, hearing the subtle click of my phone as it rang out, but it only deepened the silence. The call went straight to voicemail, her voice on the recording gentle and familiar, a stark contrast to the static weight it left behind when she didn't pick up. Night was beginning to fall now, slipping across the sky in slow shades of blue and gray. It wasn't late yet, but the shadows creeping in through the windows made the time feel heavier, as though the day was slowly releasing its grip. I sat in a chair near the corner of the room, surrounded by lamplight, as I stared ahead in thought. Lauren's absence felt palpable now, not just her words missing from the screen, but her presence, her laughter that tied our days together, the way she'd rest her hand lightly on my knee without thinking, those small threads that I hadn't realized were holding my world in place. They weren't here anymore. I picked up my phone again, almost desperate to fill the void where her silence had lodged itself. "Lauren, please, just let me know you're okay." My hands hesitated before I pressed the final period. It felt more real now, more urgent. Still, the screen stared back at me, dark and unblinking, waiting in a way that I wasn't sure I could bear much longer. It had become impossible to ignore by then, the emptiness taking root in the absence of her reply, growing stronger in the quiet of the house. Each unanswered word, each unread message felt like an echo, bouncing back against the walls of my thoughts. I wanted to resist the feeling, to shake it off and tell myself she'd been caught up in something harmless, a busy day, a distraction she'd forgotten to announce. But the explanations didn't soothe me. They only fed the gnawing sense that something was off, painfully off. The room grew dimmer as the hour stretched onward, the comforting glow of lamplight fading into muted orange tones. The house settled further into its own fragile silence, broken only by the sound of my breath and the occasional ping of a message arriving, but not hers. I reached again for my mug of coffee, now turned cold against my fingertips. I hadn't thought of Lauren as someone who could linger in this kind of absence before. It didn't fit her. It wasn't her. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive, pressing gently against the eardrums, humming faintly in its stillness. I sat in the living room, the soft amber glow of a single lamp spilling across the room, casting deep shadows on the walls. Outside, the world seemed to hold its breath. The occasional rustle of leaves brushing against the windows only emphasized how deeply alone I felt in that moment. My eyes flicked instinctively toward the clock on the mantel, its brass hands unwavering as they crept toward 11. The warmth of the blanket draped lightly over my lap did little to ease the chilly unease that grew steadily in my chest. The mug of chamomile tea in my hand had long gone lukewarm, my habit of losing track of time far from new. My fingers remained curled around the ceramic as though it could somehow anchor me, provide some comfort as the minutes ticked along. I focused on the rhythmic ticking of the clock, a steady companion in the absence of voices, in the absence of her. It was unlike her to be this late. Every small creak of the house's old bones made me lift my head, listening for the sound of keys jangling, of hurried footsteps on the porch. Each time I leaned forward instinctively, my heart rising just slightly, only to sink when the stillness returned. By now, my unease had shifted into muffled worry. My mind wandered through all the possibilities, both innocent and sinister, though I tried to steer away from the darker roads that opened in my thoughts. It was no use. They lingered like dark clouds at the edges of my mind, filling the silence with a tension I couldn't shake. I felt the muscles in my neck tighten, and I forced myself to exhale slowly. Let the breath leave my body, releasing some of the weight that had coiled there. Flipping my phone over on the coffee table for the 5th time, I checked the screen. No messages, no missed calls. I debated texting her again, but decided against it. The first few texts I'd sent earlier were still unanswered. Nothing urgent, mind you, just casual little notes about the day, things I'd wanted to share at the time, before I realized how late it was getting. My thumb hovered over the screen now, lingering before I placed the phone back down with a deliberate effort. She'd be home soon. She always came home. Another glance at the clock, 10:55. In the silence, I swore I could hear it turning ever so faintly, its deliberate progress a sharp contrast to my growing impatience. I told myself to relax, leaning back against the cushions and closing my eyes. The fabric of the couch was soft and familiar beneath my hands. I tried focusing on the texture, the slight roughness of the woven threads. Sometimes grounding myself in small things helped. Sometimes. The air in the house felt heavier now, like it had shifted somehow with the lateness of the hour. The kind of weight that settles in when you've been waiting alone too long and you start to sense the quiet more keenly. Every creak and whisper of the old wood carrying a faint undertone that sets the skin crawling just slightly. I shook my head at myself, letting out a soft, humorless laugh under my breath. What was I so wound up about? Then, just as the thought crossed my mind, I heard it. A sound from outside, not the scraping of tree branches or the distant call of an owl, but something heavier. The faint crunch of footsteps on the gravel of our driveway. I straightened in my seat, heart quickening, my eyes snapping toward the front door. The sound was followed by a pause, then the soft, metallic jingle of keys. My breath caught ever so slightly as I sat there, waiting, suspended in the brief eternity of that moment. The doorknob turned and the front door pushed open with a low creak. She stepped inside. The sight of her brought immediate relief, a flood of it, though it was quickly tempered by something I couldn't quite place. She paused in the doorway for a moment, silhouetted against the faint light spilling in behind her. Her figure was familiar, a welcome sight after the long hours that had passed, but there was something about her tonight. Something in the way she stood so still, the way her head tilted just slightly as her eyes met mine. "Hey," I said softly, my voice breaking the quiet. It came out gentle, tentative, as though I were testing the waters. She didn't respond right away, stepping inside and letting the door click shut behind her. The faintest draft of cool night air followed her in before being swallowed by the warmth of the house. "Hi," she said after a moment, her voice light but distant, carrying an edge I couldn't quite define. Her hair was slightly mussed, as if she'd been caught in the breeze, and she brushed it back absently. Then she smiled, not a warm, preoccupied sort of smile, but something else entirely. A small, lopsided smirk that tugged at the corner of her mouth. Her eyes held mine as she smiled, and for a moment I wasn't sure what to do with the unease that sprang up in me. "You're late," I said quietly, keeping my tone light, though the words carried a question I hadn't spoken aloud. My fingers tightened slightly around the cooling mug in my lap. "Am I?" she replied, her voice soft, almost amused. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable as she slipped out of her shoes and set them neatly by the door. Her movements were calm, deliberate, as though she wasn't in a hurry to explain herself, as though the lateness of the hour was of no consequence. She shrugged out of her coat and hung it on the hook by the door, pausing there, her back to me for a moment longer than necessary. I waited, asked nothing. The words hovered at the tip of my tongue, but I didn't speak them. Instead, I sat there, watching the way she reached up to tuck her hair behind her ear as she turned back toward me. The smirk still lingered on her lips, that strange, quiet amusement that seemed to know something I didn't. My pulse quickened, not in fear exactly, but in the way one's body reacts to things it doesn't fully understand. She walked past me into the room, her steps barely audible against the rug. "How was your evening?" I asked at last, trying to keep my voice even, casual. The edges of the words felt fragile somehow, as though too much pressure might break them apart. I watched her closely as I spoke, waiting for her answer. She glanced at me over her shoulder. "Fine," she said simply, her tone offering nothing more. She crossed the room to the side table, reaching for the small vase that held a few faded flowers, fingertips brushing against the glass. She seemed to hesitate for a moment, then turned back toward me. "And yours?" she asked. Her voice was light again, nearly a question, though it felt more like an echo. I opened my mouth to respond, but the way she was looking at me, head tilted slightly, her gaze steady, searching, made me pause. There was a quiet weight between us now, subtle and unspoken, growing in the spaces where words might have gone. "It was fine," I replied at last, though the words felt empty, inadequate. My eyes studied her face, watching for any flicker of something familiar, any clue as to what lingered just out of reach. Long, quiet. She smiled faintly at that, a slow curve of her lips that carried no humor. For a moment I thought she might elaborate, and the tension that bound me eased just slightly as I waited for her to speak. But she didn't. She only stood there, one hand still resting lightly on the vase, as though both of us were waiting for the other to break the silence. And so we remained, caught in that delicate standoff, the clock on the mantel ticking steadily in the quiet. I sat there, the soft hum of the living room lamp a faint presence in the thick quiet that pressed around me. The shadows it cast stretched long and lopsided, bending with the pattern of the furniture, twisting on the walls like muted whispers caught in the amber light. My knees were bent, hands resting on the tops of my thighs, fingers lightly drumming a rhythm I couldn't match to any song I knew. It was just something to do, something to steady the gnawing edge of the void that had crept into this house, into me. I heard her before I saw her, the soft creak of the floorboards upstairs, the ones that always betrayed their walker. Not deliberate, no. The sound was far too patient for that. Each step was measured, almost reluctant, like a weight testing where it should rest. and then silence again, stretching long and thin, heavy, before it broke with the rustle of footsteps descending the stairs. My eyes moved toward the hallway a second before she appeared. Half lit in the spill of the lamplight, she drifted into view. Her face was unreadable, but familiar. Isn't that strange? How a face you know so well can still hold itself away, withholding easy answers in the tilt of a brow or the small passing flicker of the mouth. Her smirk, faint but unmistakable, was there, not wide enough to make you certain of its meaning, but enough for your mind to trip over the question anyway. I watched her, quiet, as she made her way to the small table by the window where the curtain hung loose in one corner. She reached for the fabric absent-mindedly, slipping it between her fingers and smoothing it out before letting it fall back into place. She didn't look at me immediately, though she knew I was watching her. She must have felt it. That weight between us, that unspoken knot of thoughts tying and untying itself over the distance of the room. Where were you? My question finally broke the silence, my voice quiet, deliberate, almost too careful in how I shaped the words. There was no anger there, no sharp edge, only the slow, muted cadence of curiosity dipped in something harder to name. The way you speak when you don't want to admit how much you've been turning something over in your mind. She tilted her head slightly, her fingers still brushing over the curtain's fabric. And then, nothing. No answer. Just that flicker of a smirk again. Something unreadable, there and not there, a brief shadow passing over her lips before her expression fell back to neutral. She looked out the window instead, her gaze soft but distant, as though the glass opened onto some other world I couldn't see. I waited, I said, leaning forward in the chair now, my fingers lacing together to stop their restless movement. I didn't know where you'd gone. I let the words settle in the space between us, watching her for some reaction, some word, some gesture that might give away what she was thinking. But all she did was draw a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling in a way so measured it almost felt rehearsed. I couldn't sleep, she said finally, her voice faint, nearly swallowed by the quiet. The calmness of it somehow felt sharper than I expected, like it cut through the room not with force but with its simplicity. She turned then, facing me fully for the first time, not stepping closer, just rotating enough so that her eyes were on me, though they held none of the answers I'd been hoping for. Her smirk was gone now, replaced by something more still, more open. But even that openness felt guarded, as though she'd drawn back just one thin veil, but let another fall behind it. She crossed her arms loosely over her chest, fingertips brushing the fabric of the sweater she wore. There was a weight to her words, those three that lingered in the air. I couldn't sleep. They were simple enough, weren't they? And yet, like her smirk, they carried a certain elusiveness that left me unsettled. Because the way she said them, soft and gentle, made them sound true but not whole, as if she were offering me a sip of her thoughts while hiding the bottle. I couldn't either, I murmured after a stretch of quiet, mirroring her calm tone but letting a thread of warmth into my voice. Maybe it was my way of reaching out, of trying to meet her in that place beyond words where connection didn't need to be said, only felt. But she didn't respond. Her arms stayed crossed, her weight shifting subtly from one foot to the other, her gaze dipping briefly to the floor before finding the window once again. She didn't need to say it. I could feel it. That gap between us, wide enough to notice, but not yet distant enough to name. It was there in the way she stood, in the way her words hung just out of reach, and in the way I found myself suddenly unsure if I should press further or let the conversation drift. There's a certain kind of disquiet that comes not from raised voices, but from words that don't arrive at all. And in that moment, that was what surrounded me, the heavy stillness of an unanswered question, one that felt too fragile to push, yet too strange to ignore. I stood up slowly, moving toward her with a calm I hoped mirrored the air between us. The floor, warm beneath my bare feet, gave a slight creak as I stepped closer. She didn't stir from her place, her silhouette framed loosely by the dim outline of the window. I stopped just a step away, close enough to feel the faint trace of cool air that seemed to whisper in from the glass, but not close enough to cross the space that was hers alone. "Talk to me," I said softly, barely above a whisper, the gentleness in my voice deliberate. There were no demands in the words, no edge to cut against, just an invitation, simple and plain, meant to coax rather than corner. For a moment, something softened in her. Her arms relaxed slightly, her hands falling to her sides. She glanced at me then, her eyes meeting mine, and it felt like a thread between us might tighten and pull. But just as quickly as the moment came, it flickered away. Her smirk returned, not sharp or mocking, but laced with that quiet mystery I couldn't quite decipher. "I'll talk when I'm ready," she said finally, the corners of her lips tilting slightly upward. And then, without another word, she turned and began to walk away, her bare footsteps light against the floorboards as she moved toward the stairs again. I watched her go, an inexplicable mix of curiosity and frustration rising in me, wrapping itself around that lingering silence she left behind. I stayed where I was, staring at the place where she'd stood, the light catching the faint trail of warmth she'd left in the air. Something about the finality of her departure felt both expected and strange, as if I had known she wouldn't stay, known that this conversation couldn't possibly end with answers. Not yet. But even knowing didn't ease the ache of it, the weight of still not knowing. I lowered myself into the chair again, leaned my head back, and let the deep quiet wash over me once more. The lamp's light still spilled steadily across the room, and the shadows stretched on around me, soft and familiar, as if trying to keep me company. But the weight of her smirk, her silence, lingered too, coiling in the corners, slipping between the lines of my thoughts, and settling somewhere I couldn't quite reach. I closed my eyes, breathing slow and measured, hoping the rhythm might steady me. But her absence remained. With my hands still resting on my thighs, I stared at the wall across from me, tracing the uneven edges of the shadows the lamp cast. The faint hum of the bulb seemed to stretch the silence, pulling it taut like a thread. The quiet of the house had settled into me, curled around my thoughts, and I grew uneasy beneath its weight. The smirk, her smirk, kept replaying in my mind, uninvited, arriving like the melody of a tune you can't shake. It was there again, this time sharper, clearer, tethered to the glaring silence she left in her wake. I closed my eyes briefly, searching for something, peace perhaps, or clarity, but all I found was the image of her smile, frozen in place, framed by the warm light of the late afternoon. It was faint, understated, a wisp of something half forgotten, half intended. She hadn't spoken much since she came home, and now I couldn't stop analyzing the reasons why. The moment bore edges I couldn't smooth, and now my mind stretched it too, much like those shadows on the wall, twisting, billowing, distorting in ways I couldn't control. The silence had been so startling, so full. I had expected her to say something when she walked in, even just a casual remark about her day or the weather, yet her words never came. She had simply smiled that unreadable smile, too soft to be mocking, too reserved to be playful. The memory of it gnawed at me, and no matter how hard I tried to push it away, it stubbornly clung there, just beneath my thoughts. Outside, The low rustle of leaves in the wind called my attention back, grounding me for a moment. Yet even nature felt unsettled. The breeze sounded fractured, as though the air was unsure which way to move. Maybe she was tired, I thought. The day had been long after all, but no, that didn't fully explain it. She had been perfectly silent as she moved through the room earlier, quiet enough that I could feel her presence without hearing her. That stillness was unnatural, not the kind that comes from exhaustion or from slipping into comfort after stepping into one's home. It felt purposeful, intentional. The smirk, too. It felt deliberate somehow, brimming with something I couldn't name. I shook my head, easing one hand onto the couch beside me, trailing my fingertips gently across the soft fabric. The texture was soothing, a quiet counterpoint to the noise stirring in my mind. I tried to think of what could have transpired throughout her day to ignite such a change, to shift the air between us without a single word spoken. Had something gone wrong? Perhaps at work, or with one of her friends? A passing moment somewhere that unsettled her? But even as I entertained those guesses, they felt hollow, dismissed as quickly as they formed. I couldn't recall anything unusual leading up to today. The morning had felt normal, pleasant even. Her parting kiss still hung soft on my cheek when she walked out the door earlier. I'd noticed nothing out of place in her demeanor then, no shadow of doubt lingering on her face. I sighed, stretching my legs and leaning back against the couch. The leather creaked softly, the faint sound filling the spaces around me for a beat. It wasn't the kind of sound meant to comfort, not really. It merely existed, floating near me. Another thought tugged at the edges of my mind, needling its way forward with persistence. Was it me? Had I done something unknowingly, something small and unnoticed but strong enough to fracture the rhythm between us? The thought sat heavy as soon as it came to life. My fingers, now still against the couch, felt like they carried the weight of it. I couldn't think of a moment, hadn't sensed any shift in the days leading to this. But what if I had missed it? What if the silence was a reaction, a reflection of something said or done, something unintentional but consequential all the same? A soft creak came from the kitchen, a crack in the silence, and I turned my head toward the sound without moving. My breathing slowed. The noise was faint, fleeting, probably just the house releasing tension into the world. It reminded me of how she had moved earlier, her footsteps muted as she crossed the room, almost too soft for me to hear. That quietness was haunting now, replaying itself rhythmically in my mind. I wanted to ask her what it had all meant, but I couldn't. Not now. She had gone upstairs hours ago without a word, leaving a thick question waiting behind her. The internal pull toward conflict wasn't just a whisper anymore. It had grown heavier, louder, demanding to be heard above the calm I tried to hold. The thoughts swirled incessantly now, a slow spiral I couldn't escape even though I wanted to. My peace of mind had been fractured, and despite the calm exterior, I felt something brewing inside me, something that twisted and stretched each possibility until all I could feel was tension. My exhale was deliberate and measured, bringing with it a brief respite, though even that moment was fleeting. I shifted, pressing the heel of my palm lightly against my temple and tracing my thumb over the edge of my jaw. My gaze drifted toward the window adjacent to the couch. The night felt large outside, its weight pressing against the glass. The frame seemed to hum faintly, reflecting back a darkness almost too deep to look into. Not a single car had passed since I'd sat down here. Even the wind had grown quieter now, restrained, watching. My thoughts, unlike the night itself, were anything but still. They raced along paths uncertain and half-built, finding ways to circle the same image of her smile over and over. I wondered briefly if it was possible to turn it off, to stop wondering and let the sensation of the night wrap around me instead. I leaned back farther into the couch, closing my eyes as the hum of the lamp and the muted sounds of the living room swam around me. Another memory bubbled up, the way her hand grazed the edge of the table as she passed earlier, the faint scrape of metal against wood as her ring caught the edge. At the time, I barely noticed it, but now it sat in my mind like a sharp detail meant for closer analysis. Was there meaning there? Or was this the result of my own spiraling, a web woven by my need to decipher what couldn't be deciphered? The mental tug-of-war felt exhausting, each side pulling with equal strength, leaving me rooted in place like the faint shadows on the wall. The warmth of the lamp near me was soothing, the amber glow reaching toward me with soft edges. I imagined it curling against my skin, brushing me lightly as though it too sensed the unease that settled deeply into my chest. Still, I couldn't silence the brewing conflict entirely. It had taken root, and ignoring it felt impossible, like trying to tune out a storm outside while lying wide awake under the safety of a roof. Even in the quiet, the storm could always be heard. I frowned slightly as another thought surfaced, unbidden. Was the smirk a form of dismissal? Something subtle disguised within her expression earlier, a feeling too faint for me to grasp in full, but just strong enough to leave me guessing? Could it have hidden something more? Perhaps irritation bubbling beneath the surface, held back, but lightly visible if you looked close enough. I hated how unsure I was, how little I knew about what she was thinking or feeling when she walked through the door. The uncertainty settled onto me in layers, growing heavier each time I tried to ease it away. I got up slowly, the couch creaking softly as I lifted myself. My legs felt stiff, unsteady, like I'd been sitting for longer than I realized. As I crossed the room, the floor beneath me held faint whispers of sound, the soft creak of wood brushing against the edges of my existence here. Yet even that sound felt quieter now. With each step, her silence seemed louder, a presence that surrounded me even when she wasn't there. I paused beside the window, the still air brushing against my skin. My fingers lightly traced the edge of the glass, cool to the touch, smooth like water held firmly in place. Closing my eyes, I tried again to quiet the storm of thoughts, to let the present moment pull me back from wherever these doubts were leading me. But even with the rhythmic hum of that lamp behind me, its warm light as steady as ever, I could feel the weight of the questions returning. The smirk, the silence, the soft tension wrapped delicately in every choice she had made since she came home hours ago. The answers, though, stayed hidden, and the night stretched endlessly ahead of me, waiting. The hum of the lamp seemed louder now, a droning counterpoint to the silence that filled the house. My fingers had stilled, resting idly on my thighs. A faint warmth lingered there from the fabric of my pants, though the chill in the air seemed more pronounced now, prickling at the back of my neck, just beneath the hairline. I drew in a steady breath, letting the quiet stretch out between the walls and within myself. In the bedroom, I could hear the faint shuffle of movement, a sound light enough it might have been my imagination, or it might have been her. I hadn't seen her since she went upstairs, her smirk still a vivid echo in my mind. It was as though that expression had been burned into the spaces behind my eyelids. Every time I closed my eyes, there it was again, coy and unreadable, a curtain drawn over something intangible. I let out the breath I had been holding without realizing it, then rose slowly to my feet. My steps across the living room felt deliberate, each one a soft press against the wooden floors, a quiet protest as the boards shifted underfoot. The air seemed cooler, as I reached the staircase. Perhaps it was the draft from some unseen window, or maybe it was simply the stillness, the kind of stillness that stole warmth from the air and pooled in the corners of shadowed rooms. One hand brushed the banister, smooth wood cool beneath my fingertips, as my feet found the first step and then the next, carrying me closer to where she was. The upstairs hall was dark, except for a faint line of light spilling out from beneath the door to our bedroom. It stretched weakly across the worn carpet, painting a pale stripe that faded into nothing before it reached the opposite wall. I stood there for a moment, watching the line of light and the slight, almost imperceptible shift in its edges, as though it were alive and breathing ever so faintly. I reached for the doorknob, the cool metal fitting neatly into the curve of my palm. For a moment I hesitated with my hand there, acknowledging the curious weight in my chest. It wasn't fear, not quite, more like the strain of an unanswered question, tangible and insistent. Slowly, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. She was there. Her back was to me, her dark hair spilling over the shoulders of her sweater. She stood by the window, one hand resting lightly on the sill. The light from the bedside lamp softened the room, a faint amber glow casting thin shadows along the walls. Outside, the world beyond the glass was black and unknowable, the reflective surface of the window turning everything inward, reframing the room around us in muted, ghostly outlines. "You're still awake," I said softly, my voice breaking the quiet like a pebble dropped into still water. The heaviness in the air barely shifted. It lingered, watching us, listening carefully. She didn't turn, though her posture shifted just slightly, a subtle tension drawing up through her shoulders. "I couldn't sleep," she replied after a pause, her voice light and airy, carried on a tone that didn't quite fit. The words sounded rehearsed somehow, like something placed carefully where sincerity should have been. "Neither could I said, stepping further into the room. The door closed softly behind me, a click more felt than heard. I keep going over it, trying to sort through it, but my words trailed into the space between us unfinished, leaving room for her to fill it. I waited. She didn't. "What is it?" I asked gently, each word a deliberate effort to grasp the wisps of something I couldn't see, something I could only feel and sense in the way she moved, in the way the air shifted subtly as she turned her head just slightly, her profile catching the edge of the lamplight. "What's been on your mind tonight?" Her hand slid away from the windowsill and came to rest at her side. Her fingers almost seemed to curl in, brushing against the soft fabric of her sweater as though clutching at some unseen thing tethered there. I watched her carefully, my gaze tracking the movement, the faint, quiet breath she took before she answered. "Nothing," she said, a single word offered up like a sliver of mist, insubstantial, fleeting. "It's just been a long day." I swallowed against the lump in my throat. The tightness that came from how easily she spoke, how the words slipped from her lips like it bore no weight, no tether to the moment between us. "It doesn't feel like nothing," I said, each word slow and careful. They felt fragile as I let them go, fragile enough to break with the slightest misstep. "It feels like you've been somewhere else ever since earlier. Like you've been trying to tell me something, but you won't." She turned then, just enough for me to meet her gaze, though her expression was unreadable as ever. Her eyes, deep and quiet, held something I couldn't touch, like shadows that moved in the periphery of my mind. "You think too much," she said softly, a faint smile curling her lips, not quite warm, more like the memory of warmth, like a flicker of something long ago soothed. "I'm fine, truly." The silence that followed felt stretched and hollow. I let it settle for a beat, maybe more, waiting for her to say something else, anything else that might allow me to understand. But she didn't. Her gaze lingered only a moment longer before she turned back to the window, her reflection dissolving into the nightmarish black outside. "Maybe I do think too much," I murmured. The distance between us felt larger than it was, the physical space shrinking while the intangible one seemed to yawn wide, unspeakably vast. I stepped closer, my movements slow and deliberate, pausing just a couple of feet away. But it's hard not to, when the person who knows you better than anyone feels far away. "I'm just tired," she whispered finally, the words brushing the air so softly they almost disappeared. "That's all, really." I studied her again, tracing the curve of her spine beneath her sweater, the delicate line of her jaw framed by her hair. Everything about her in that moment felt like it was caught somewhere between stillness and motion, between speaking and silence. My chest rose and fell with a sigh too soft to disturb the quiet. "Okay," I said, nearly matching her tone. "Okay." I let the silence gather itself again, curling around us like the folds of some heavy curtain. I stuffed my hands in my pockets, my fingers brushing against the smooth lining as I studied the faint glow of the lamplight against her face. "I think I'll make some tea," I said then, a shift in tone, and offering as much for myself as for her. "Would you like some?" She shook her head ever so slightly, still facing the window. "No, thank you." The cadence of her voice was polite but distant, a corner of her lips quirking upward in a shadow of the smirk that lingered from earlier. I watched her for a moment longer, but there was nothing more to be said, not now at least. The stillness of her posture seemed to content itself with the quiet, and as much as clarity felt just beyond my reach, I knew intuition alone wouldn't draw it closer tonight. Whatever it was, she wasn't ready to give it shape. Turning, I stepped out of the room, closing the door gently behind me. The hallway stretched out in its dark, familiar way, the faint hiss of my breath a constant companion as I made my way downstairs again. The lamp in the living room cast long fingers of shadow against the wall, reaching and spreading, almost as though it had been waiting for me to return. The house sighed around me, wood creaking in some distant corner, as if it too felt restless tonight. In the kitchen, I slid open the drawer where we kept the tea, the small packets rustling faintly as I searched through them without too much focus. The warmth of the kettle on the stove moments later felt grounding, the hiss and gurgle of boiling water steady and soothing, a counter-rhythm to the searching thoughts that pried without permission at the corners of my mind. I stared at the teacup as steam began to curl from its surface, delicate tendrils melting into the air. My fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic, grounding me where I stood. In the other room, the lamp hummed on. The room felt heavier now, as if the air itself had thickened, folding in on me like the weight of something unseen. The soft hum of the lamp still stretched across the silence, a quiet companion to the restless back and forth pacing of my thoughts. I made no effort to stop them. They moved freely now, cascading into one another, circling the same unresolved tension that lingered in the air between us. I let my gaze wander across the room, though there was nothing new to see. The walls seemed a shade darker, touched by the night that grew outside. The shadows had shifted again, pulling long and low against the old rug that hugged the floor beneath the coffee table. My fingertips brushed against my thighs absent-mindedly, the rhythm of before forgotten now, replaced by a stillness that felt as much external as internal. Beside me, her presence was distant, though only in the sense that I could feel her pulling inward. Physically, she hadn't moved. She had settled into the corner of the couch hours ago, her arms sprawled lazily over the armrest, head angled in a way that allowed her to stare past me at some point along the far wall. She hadn't said much, not since the smirk, and I couldn't bring myself to ask if there was something left in her that wanted to. I wondered if her silence was deliberate or if it simply matched the silence between us. It didn't matter. What lingered now wasn't the kind of silence that begged to be broken, but rather the kind that seemed to build walls higher than either of us could climb. The warmth of the fabric beneath my fingertips had begun to fade into coolness, though the air around me felt warmer somehow, flushed with the faint heat that drifted from the lamp. It was an odd contrast. My skin prickled still, more so now than before, though I wasn't sure if it was from the chill or the change that seemed to hang in the space we were sharing. Not together, but parallel. I shifted my shoulders slightly, as though that might ease the tightness that had been creeping in since the quiet started. She breathed deeply once, not loud, not sharp, but with just enough weight to pull my attention. I glanced at her briefly, careful not to linger long enough for her to notice. Her gaze hadn't moved from its place along the far wall, locked and distant, as though her gaze had fallen into some memory or thought too far away for me to follow. Even then, a part of me wondered if she was thinking about the same thing I was, if the smirk was replaying in her mind the same way it was in mine. That small, subtle lift of her lips, caught in the amber light. It had held something, though I couldn't say what. It had been so brief that perhaps it was nothing at all. But even the faintest gestures had weight when the quiet pressed this heavy. Her breath softened again, evening out into a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. It was slow and measured, controlled, but still it carried the weight of something unsaid, coating the thin air between us with an invisible tension I didn't know how to breach. I sat there, still, my own breath pressing gently against the tightness in my chest, scoring and smoothing the edges of the questions I hadn't yet asked. Did I want to ask them, genuinely, or was I afraid of how they might sound in the brittle quiet, too sharp, too intrusive, too much for a night this heavy? The faintest rustle of fabric pulled me from my thoughts momentarily. She shifted her legs, crossing one over the other, her toes lightly brushing the edge of the coffee table as they settled into position. The movement was small, but its intention felt distant, calculated even, a necessary adjustment rather than one of passing comfort. My eyes drifted for a moment, catching the outline of her silhouette in the soft glow of the lamp's light. She seemed smaller somehow, though the room hadn't changed, the walls hadn't shrunk. It was in the way she carried herself, curled ever so slightly inward, her arms resting closer to her than usual, her posture angled subtly away. I wondered how long this quiet would carry us. I leaned back slightly, pressing into the cushion beneath me, the rough fabric scratching gently against my shirt. The sensation was grounding in a way that the silence wasn't. My breath steadied, not because I wanted it to, but because it seemed the easiest way to keep the growing tension within me from spilling outward. I thought briefly of speaking, of saying something, but the words refused to surface, buried deep under thoughts too heavy to lift. Instead, I swallowed them back, letting them settle somewhere deep in my chest, unseen but present. The hum of the lamp swelled again, audible only because there was nothing to compete with it. I focused on it briefly, the faint vibration humming low in its glass casing. It was rhythmic, balanced, a sound that didn't ask anything of me, didn't press or pull. I kept my gaze lowered to the floor as I shifted slightly in my seat, soft creaks from the couch whispering into the otherwise undisturbed quiet. The skin of my fingertips pressed lightly against the fabric of my pants, grounding me, though only enough to keep me from unraveling. I let my hand fall, resting gently against my knee, a movement so slight I wasn't sure it would even register as change. Her breath dipped again, not heavily, not noticeably, but enough to visibly pull her shoulders inward, narrowing her frame against the backdrop of the couch. I looked at her again, this time following the curve of her profile. Her soft jaw set loosely in the light, the faint contrast between it and the shadows that had tucked themselves around her. She hadn't moved, not really, not enough to acknowledge that we were both here in this moment, sharing the space even as we retreated further into our own heads. I could see it on her face, the way she held her gaze far beyond me, as though searching for something that didn't live here, didn't exist in this room or in this quiet. The weight of uncertainty pressed down again, heavier now than before. My hands shifted against my knees once, then again, pressing gently into the fabric that had grown cool beneath them. I wanted to say something, but what was there to say? The quiet had stretched too far between us, grown too dense to cut through with words that might crack the fragility we'd both fallen into tonight. Still, the questions swirled, floating in my chest like light debris caught in some calming current. Did she want to say something, or had she already decided there was nothing left? Her smirk, subtle, fleeting, lingered in my mind's eye, pulling at the edges of my thoughts. It had been long enough since it happened that I wondered if I was imagining its weight entirely. But no, there had been meaning in it, though the meaning itself refused to show its face clearly. It was the kind of thing you carry without intention, a response so slight it hardly registers in the moment, but leaves behind an imprint you can't quite brush away. It echoed now, faint but persistent. I closed my eyes briefly, only long enough to ease the tired sting that had gathered behind them. I let my breath break softly against my lips, measured yet uneven, willing my shoulders to soften with the slow fall of my exhale. The space between us seemed to stretch further then, not in distance but in depth. So much unspoken. How long could we sit like this, drifting parallel without truly touching? When I opened my eyes again, the lamp seemed dimmer. Perhaps my eyes had adjusted too quickly to the darkness, or perhaps it simply was. The shadows had grown again, pulling deeper into the creases of the room, their edges blurred just enough to seem more like clouds than sharp contours. Her gaze remained fixed, nearly unwavering, the faint matte shine of her eyes catching the amber light with a muted gleam. The way she sat, the way she held herself, it felt practiced now, as though settling within herself was a discipline long learned, long rehearsed. And yet her shoulders told another story, a quiet unsteadiness she might not have even realized was there. I felt the weight of my own tension then, heavy in my abdomen, pulling tightly at the muscles that strained against it. My body felt tired, but not in the way I understood tiredness to be. It was something else, something wrapped up in the quiet, something laced through the absence of movement, of connection. I shifted again, pressing gently into the resistance of the couch, the rough texture scratching lightly at the fabric of my shirt. I drew in another breath, not sharp, but steady, and let my chest rise to meet the cool of the stale air that hung thick and unmoving between us. Her arm shifted slightly against the armrest, though her gaze remained locked in its place to my right, far past anything I could see. The creases of the couch folded neatly beneath her movement, their uneven curves catching the faint amber hue that spilled across them. Her fingers curled loosely against the edge, motionless now, save for the faint twitch of her thumb against the arm of the cushion. Even that movement felt distant, not deliberate or reactive, but natural in its absence of intention. The thought returned again, unsettling but present, that perhaps the quiet wasn't broken because it wasn't ours to break. It held something now, something neither of us dared touch, something that implied its own permanence, its own eternity, and yet the weight pressed heavier still. The faint hum of the lamp seemed unchanged in its rhythm, stretched thin beneath the weight of the silence that had settled so deeply into the house. It played on, low and steady, like a thread woven through the quiet moments that kept me tethered. Yet there was something about this hour, this profound, still hour just before dawn, that softened the edges of everything. My thoughts, restless and unpredictable all night, now seemed to wane ever so slightly, as though the tide had begun its slow retreat. The air felt heavy, yes, but it was different now, a gentler heaviness, one that no longer threatened to consume me. I shifted in my chair, the faint creak beneath me breaking the silence just barely. The fabric of the seat cushion was nearly cool to the touch now. The warmth from my body had all but disappeared. Letting out a quiet sigh, I ran my fingertips across the edge of the wooden armrest, tracing the grain, the grooves that told a story far older than me. My fingers slowed where the wood curved inward, worn smooth by years of touch, a fleeting glimpse of those who had once filled this space long before. And yet, in this moment, the house felt as though it belonged only to us, and to the estranged silence hanging over it. Her smirk lingered somewhere in the farthest recesses of my mind, a shadow that refused to fully dissipate no matter how long I sat here, no matter how many breaths I pulled into my chest with measured care. I hadn't seen her properly since that moment. A fleeting glance, a flicker of something substantial that had slipped through the cracks between us. It had been enough to unsettle me, to twist the threads of my thoughts in ways I wasn't yet prepared to understand. But now, in the quiet minutes before dawn, I could sense something shifting, a current moving imperceptibly beneath the surface. The light in the hallway was dimmer than I remembered, its glow softened with the passing hours. From where I sat, the narrow stretch of darkness between the walls seemed to invite rather than impose. I rose from the chair slowly, the muscles in my legs tight and unsteady from hours spent still. My joints felt stiff, reminding me of the time I'd spent lingering here in my own head, a small, quiet space where the ticking of the clock had dissolved into the background noise. Every small movement I made seemed amplified in the silence. There was the rustle of fabric as my sleeve brushed against my side, the soft squeak of the floorboards as I shifted my weight, the whisper of air that followed me as I moved closer to the hallway. The texture of the wall against my fingertips was oddly grounding. I traced small patterns there, inventing shapes where none existed, the cool surface holding me steady as I paused. I heard nothing from the other room, though a flicker, so faint I almost missed it, of light pooled toward the edge of the threshold. She was awake. Of course she was. There was no doubt now, though I couldn't pinpoint what drove me to this certainty. Her presence had its own weight, magnetic and elusive, a pull I couldn't explain. I stepped forward and paused just before the doorframe. The air here felt subtly different, as though it carried traces of movement, barely perceptible yet unmistakable. The faint scent of something hung near, something floral and distant, like a memory you couldn't quite reach. It wasn't unfamiliar, yet it felt new in its context, misplaced in the tension that defined the last day. I leaned against the edge of the doorway for a moment, listening, not to her, but to the quiet equilibrium that had settled between these walls. There was no need to rush, no need to fill the silence just yet. I let it linger, breathing in the subtle weight of the space, allowing the stillness to stretch into something almost sacred. When I finally stepped through, I saw her, a faint silhouette, seated at the far edge of the bed, her back curved slightly inward. The familiar line of her shoulders, so often rigid with defiance, had softened now, as though the tension from the day had carved its way out of her, leaving only traces of its existence. Her head was turned to the window, where the first dim washes of light filtered through the glass. She wasn't watching, not really. Her gaze was suspended somewhere between the window and the horizon, somewhere distant. I caught the faintest rise and fall of her breath, the gentle rhythm of her chest pulling inward before releasing into the cool air. The patterned texture of the blanket beneath her fingertips seemed to ground her just as the walls had steadied me moments before. I didn't speak. Not yet. There was an intimacy to this quiet, a delicate pause in motion that felt too fragile to interrupt. Instead, I reached forward, letting my fingertips meet the wooden frame of the dresser closest to me. The texture was worn, uneven where years had faded its shine, but firm in its presence, solid and unmoving. Moments passed as I watched her from across the room, the muted light scattering faint shadows over her profile. The warmth of the blanket had softened her grip, her fingers no longer searching for hold but resting idle against the fabric's surface. Then, as though the air itself shifted between us, her gaze moved, not toward me directly, but toward something close enough that it pulled her faintly into my orbit. I resisted the urge to step closer, to close the distance in hopes of breaking the fragile tension that hung between us. This was enough. It had to be enough. The small sound of her breath caught my ears, soft, barely audible above the faint hum of the lamp filtering through the walls, and I followed it. I let the sound guide me, pulling me into the subtleties of the moment. Her hand moved slightly, no longer idly resting but tracing small, tentative circles into the blanket. The movement was slow, deliberate, yet achingly hesitant. If I allowed myself to think too deeply about it, I might have found endless meaning in those small motions, answers to questions I hadn't yet learned to ask. But I didn't, because the movement itself was enough. It wasn't a smirk or a glance or an unspoken question that haunted the space between us. It was something gentler, something less pointed and more forgiving. She looked up then, not fully, but enough that her face caught the edges of the light filtering into the room. Her lips parted, not to speak, but only just, before pressing into the faintest smile. It wasn't the smirk I had played and replayed in my mind hours before. It was softer, less defined, fleeting in its presence. I couldn't hold it, couldn't memorize it long enough to define it fully. But I didn't mind that. Its impermanence felt fitting. I mirrored the motion almost unconsciously, my own lips curving into a quiet smile that resolved nothing but promised everything. The silence between us remained, stretching deeper across the room until it touched every corner. But the weight of it had shifted. It wasn't the oppressive heaviness I had struggled to understand earlier, the kind that had pulled me deeper into my chair, into myself. It was quieter now, softer. Its edges were rounded in ways I hadn't realized could be possible. I didn't move closer to her, not yet. The pace of the moment dictated patience, unhurried and steady. I stayed where I was, steadying myself against the dresser's frame, my fingertips still tracing the ridges I'd memorized minutes before. She turned back toward the blanket, her gaze falling over it in a way that felt deliberate but not dismissive. The patterns of her breathing, soft and uneven, then steady and deliberate, shifted slightly, a subtle signaling of her thoughts in motion. I could sense the change more than see it, the slow pull of the tide beginning to recede, exposing those small details that were hidden just hours ago. It wasn't an answer, not yet. It wasn't reconciliation, not entirely, but it was something that could serve as its foundation. The faint light of dawn stretched through the window, scattering across the bare corners of the room and filling those spaces where shadows had played long into the night. It was quiet again, though the hum of the lamp persisted behind us, anchoring the silence rather than interrupting it. I felt the space between us breathe, slowly, tentatively, and in that breath I felt the weight begin to unravel, thread by delicate thread. The first rays of dawn pierced through the curtains with a muted, golden light, soft enough to kiss the edges of the room without waking it entirely. The hum of the lamp, ever present through the quiet hours, seemed to fade now into the greater stillness settling over the walls, the floors, the lingering shadows clinging to corners. The air felt lighter somehow, like the weight borne through the night had finally dissipated, unraveling bit by bit as the morning inched closer. I felt it before I saw it. The shift, the thawing of something once stiff and unyielding. The tension that had wound so tightly around us softened like frost melting under the warmth of spring's first glance. It wasn't dramatic, nor was it immediate. It was quiet. So quiet that had I not been paying attention, I might have missed it altogether. But still, it was there, spreading slowly in the silence between us. I turned my head ever so slightly, enough to catch the faint outline of her figure against the pale morning light. She hadn't moved much. Her posture remained guarded, a subtle lean toward the blanket drawn around her shoulders. Yet, there was a gentleness in the way her fingers rested on the edge of the chair, an absence of the rigidity they'd carried throughout the long hours preceding this moment. The sharp edge of her jaw, once set in defiance, seemed softer now, no longer caught in the tension of words unspoken. I exhaled, not deeply, nor with any grand declaration, but slowly, like my body was learning how to let go, one breath at a time. A faint rustle of fabric followed as I shifted my position, easing the night's stiffness from my limbs. My hands found the warmth of my knees, pressing gently against them before idling there, hesitant to move further. Still, she didn't turn to me, and I resisted the urge to speak. There was nothing to say, not really. Silence, in its mild insistence, had provided far more clarity than words ever could. We hadn't unraveled every knot of anger or hurt. Those things took patience, layers of time that stretched far beyond a single sleepless night. But there was something infinitely comforting in knowing that the storm had passed, and we were standing now in the fragile light of its aftermath. Outside, the faint song of birds broke through the stillness, soft notes drifting like promises into the quiet room. I felt the corners of my lips tug upward, almost involuntarily. Their melody carried with it an inexplicable kind of peace, distant, yet near enough to touch the edges of my chest. The sound mingled gently with the light tapping of the branches against the windows, their rhythm steady, soothing. I hadn't even realized how much I was listening until the comfort of those sounds started pulling me deeper into stillness. The space between us felt less jagged, less sharp. I couldn't quite call it warm, not yet, but it was no longer cold. That unspoken distance of the hours before, which had loomed like a chasm across the room, hadn't vanished entirely, but it no longer defined us. We were closer now, perhaps not in proximity, but in understanding. And it wasn't through words that we arrived here. It was something quieter, something the night itself had patiently gifted us. Her slow exhale drew my attention. It was soft, almost imperceptible, yet loud enough to break through the remaining fragments of silence between us. I caught the slight shift of her shoulders as the breath left her chest, the faint release of tension that had gripped her so tightly. It wasn't much, barely a movement, but I understood it as what it was, the the smallest offering of peace. I let my gaze drift downward, fixing on the faint patterns drawn across the rug. The swirling shapes felt almost hypnotic now, the lines weaving in and out of themselves in slow, deliberate elegance. My thoughts drifted there, following the paths set out before me, until I heard, or rather felt, her turn. She moved so quietly that I almost doubted myself. Yet, when I glanced upward again, there she was, angled just slightly toward me, her blanket slipping farther down her shoulder. She wasn't looking directly at me, not yet, but the subtle shift in her position felt like an invitation. The tension between us cracked, splintering into something softer as her posture loosened. And though her lips didn't move, the air seemed to hum with her silent speech. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't closure in the way stories often depict, wrapped in neat bows and tidy resolutions. It was acknowledgement, a shared understanding that rested quietly between us now. Without gestures or words, we had arrived there together, carried by the stillness of the night as it gave way to morning. My hand drifted to the edge of the armrest, fingers brushing lightly against the worn wood. It felt smooth beneath my touch, cool to the skin, but familiar somehow. Like the steady hum of the lamp, it anchored me in the present moment, keeping my restless mind from straying too far into the past or the future. For now there was peace, tentative, fragile peace, but peace all the same. And I wanted to stay here as long as the morning would allow. The faint rustling of fabric pulled my focus once again. I lifted my gaze to meet hers, finally catching the quiet depth in her expression. Her eyes, dark yet luminous in the pale light, held something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't relief, not exactly. It wasn't joy either. It was quieter than that, softer, like the beginnings of comfort brushing against the edges of her being. And though her gaze didn't linger long, the connection, however brief, was enough to quell the lingering echoes of doubt in my chest. Neither of us spoke, we didn't need to. The shared silence carried far more weight than words ever could. And as we sat there, letting the morning unfold around us in slow, measured waves, I felt a sense of calm settle deeply into my bones. The hum of the lamp had grown faint, retreating into the distance as daylight replaced the shadows. The softness of the air, the quiet rhythm of the house waking to life, it was enough. Enough for now. Minutes stretched into a rhythm of their own, unhurried and gentle. My thoughts, once restless and labyrinthine, had softened into fragments of stillness, each one fading tranquilly into the next. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of the moment permeate the spaces between breaths. The chair cradled me comfortably, its texture rough but reassuring, and the faint rustle of her movements near me carried its own kind of solace. The birds outside continued their song, weaving familiar notes through the morning's quiet fabric. Slowly I felt my body yield to the pull of deeper stillness, the kind of stillness that cradles all that it touches, pulling it gently toward rest. And though our words had remained unspoken, I felt something in her presence shift, a movement toward familiarity, toward something almost tender. Time stilled, stretching softly between us as the morning brightened. My body sank further into the chair, and I let my breathing guide me, slow, steady, each motion draining the last remnants of tension from my limbs. Her presence, the faint hum of life outside, the quiet rhythm of isolation giving way to connection. These were the only sensations that remained, and they carried me tenderly into the depths of calm. In the stillness of the morning, I felt myself drift further, an unspoken promise of peace lingering softly in the air. It was as though the night itself, its confrontations, its uncertainties, and its fleeting truths had finally surrendered to the moment. And within that surrender, there was comfort. The peace of knowing we didn't need all the answers tonight. The peace of finding solace in what remained unsaid. As my breathing grew slower, anchoring me gently to the warmth of my seat, I let myself lean further into the quiet. Sleep hovered close